All right, when we last left this app, we had completed the home page and we had completed the game page. So we had inserted a home page. We also did the same thing for the splash page. We put 3 buttons in. We had games, settings, and about. We completed the game page where we set up the segmented control to update the difficulty labels as well as hard code some level, score, and time left. And then that left 2 other pages left to complete. So what we're going to do next is go with the settings view controller and complete this page. So what this page is going to have is something similar to what we had in the about page, but it'll have a few different palettes in here instead, or items in here instead. So the first thing we need to do with the settings view controller is put in a nav bar. So what we're going to do is we're going to search for a navigation bar by typing in nav. And the second item here, navigation bar, will pop up. We'll bring that and we'll center it. And we'll double click on the word title and replace the word title with settings. And we'll put a back button in. We'll put a back button in, but we'll look for a button again, a bar button item. So now we're taking the bar button item, we're dragging it, placing it on the left corner. And if we double click on item, we'll replace it with the word back. And we can also change the tint to be more consistent with what's there. So last time around we used gray. Of course, you can use any color you want, just to be consistent with the other nav bar. Now the nice thing is that we've done all the legwork to implement the back button. All we have to do with this back button now is just connect it to the exit button, or the exit icon. So we're going to hold down Control, click, and drag to the exit button, let go, and choose our unwind method that we created last time around. So unwind to this view controller is what we created, and now the back button will work. And so now what we're going to do with this page is we're going to have a couple of labels, a slider, and a date picker. So the first thing we'll do is search for a label, drag that, center it, and we're going to replace it with the word volume. One more label that is. Stretch it across. And center it, but we'll leave the word label going there. And then the next thing we need is a slider. So we'll search for a slider, and we'll drag the slider in between the 2 labels. Stretch it out. So we have our volume slider, and our label that will actually depict what value the slider is giving me at any one time that the slider is there. Now let's configure the slider. So if we click on the slider and we look at its attributes here, it shows me a minimum and maximum value. So right now it's saying that it'll return a value between 0 and 1. Maybe I'll change that to be 0 and 100. And then the second option there shows me what it's going to start off with, its initial value. So it's saying 0.5, which is really low. Maybe I'll switch that to 50. Or I could switch it to 80. Or I can go with 30. Let's stick to 30. Maybe it's like 1/3 of volume level. Maybe it's more safer for the ears. And the last thing we'll do is put up a date picker. So there's something called a picker, and there's 2 types. There's a regular picker, which we'll learn about in a future app, And there's the date picker, which is basically just a picker, but configured to have date and time. So we're going to pull out the date picker and drag it and place it on the screen and try and center it nicely. And it looks like it's overlapping some stuff, so we're going to shrink it a bit. And in older iOS versions, the width of this date picker was stuck. It was fixed. We could not play with the width of the picker. In newer iOS, I believe 8 and above, we can actually narrow the width down to any width we want, which is great. But we'll leave it as the width of the screen for what we need. So now the settings page is complete. And what we can do is now we can go and write the code that we need to support the settings page. So in the settings page right now we have a slider, we have 2 labels and a date picker. We're not going to play with the date picker in this app. We're just going to put it on for illustrative purposes just to show you what a date picker looks like. But what we're going to focus heavily on is the slider and the label below it, and using the label to update the value that's on the slider. So we'll do a Command S to save, and then we'll switch over to settings viewcontroller.h. And we'll start by defining our variables. In this case, unlike the previous view controller, we had a bunch of variables. Here we're only going to have 2. We're going to have a variable for the slider and a variable for the label below it. So we're going to say IB outlet, UI slider, and then SL volume, it will be the name of it. And then we'll have IB outlet, UI label, LB volume. And then we'll go ahead and do the property declarations for both of these things by copying and pasting. And then saying property non-atomic and strong for both. Okay, and then that's it for our header file. So we do Command S to save it. And then we're going to switch over to the M file. And in the M file, we're going to start off by synthesizing our 2 variables. So we're going to say synthesize LB volume, SL volume. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a similar approach to what we did with the game view controller, where we preloaded information in view.did_load, and then we create an event handler for the segmented control, and then we create a separate method to do the updating, and then we use that separate method to be called by both view.did_load and the event handler. So we're going to create a method here to update the value of the label. I'm going to call it update label, so we'll have a void return type, update label. And I'm going to call update label inside view.did_load. So we're going to say self update label. But I'm also going to create an event handler to execute every time we touch that slider and we move it even a little bit. It's going to update the volume. So we're going to say IB action. I'm going to call it slider value changed. And inside slider value change, we'll just call update label. So we'll say self update label. So now that's left is to actually populate update label. So what we're going to do is we're going to retrieve the value of the slider. And its type is a float. So we're going to say float vol is equal to slvolume.value. That will retrieve the value of the slider at any given time that it is executed. Because it's a float, we want to convert it to a string and throw it inside a label. So let's create a string, so ns_string. We're going to call it strvol is equal to ns_string. We're going to use string with format. So just like in the previous app, we're going to use string with format here as well. And in the previous app with the calculator, what we did there was we took a value that was entered in by the user, and then we converted it to a string, and then we populate it inside the label, right? So we're going to do the exact same thing here. So string with format, the format will be inside double quotes, and we'll have a %f to represent a float. And then we'll do a comma and say vol will be the variable that will pass in to %f. So right now we created a string from a float, and then the last step is to say lb volume set text for strvol. And at this point, our M file is done. But now all we have to do is just configure the M file, the storyboard, to connect with all of the things we just created right now in the object. Okay, so we'll switch over to the M file, and we'll open up our connections inspector. So the last guy in the list. Make sure that the yellow circle is highlighted. And we should see LB volume and SL volume. So we'll drag LB volume to the label. This is the bottom label. Not the top one, because the top one is a static label. We're going to always leave it as the word volume. The bottom label is the one that's going to change all the time. So we want to connect LB volume to the bottom one. And then we have SL volume, which we're going to connect to the slider. So now SL volume, the slider value, will connect to the slider. LB volume will connect to the label. And that just leaves at the bottom of the list here, slider value changed. So this is our event handler that should execute every time we touch this slider, and we move it even a little bit. So we want to drag this and connect it to the slider. And in the previous app, we connected this to buttons, and we used touch up inside. But the purpose of that was because the purpose was we were touching the button and then letting go of it. That's when we wanted the event handler to execute. But here, this is a bit different. Here, what we're doing is we are connecting it to a slider who isn't really a button, but it has a value that will change. So if we look at the bottom of the list here, we have value changed. So we're going to choose value changed. And so now we can run this app, because now we connected the slider to the event handler. Okay, so there's our launch screen, and our buttons. So if we go to the settings page, we can start toying with the slider, and we'll see the value change on the fly. Okay. We also have our date picker. Right? And you can configure the date picker any way you want. You can drop the time, you can have date only, you can drop the date and have time only. There's a number of different ways you can do with the date picker to get the date and time any way you want. Hit the back button, it goes back to the home page. And we still have our easy, medium, hard from the game page. So that's still working. Right? So we have the first two pages working. The About button, though, it still has yet to be done. And that's the next thing that we're going to work on. Okay, so we finished the settings page. And now the last thing to do is the About page here. The About page is going to have a web view, and it'll load up any web page we want. And it'll also have like a little spinner known as an activity indicator that will spin while we're waiting for this thing to load. But the first thing we need to do here in the storyboard is actually configure the page and start off with getting a navigation bar. So we'll say nav in the search bar here and bring up a navigation bar and put that at the top of our page and center it. And then for the title, we'll change this to be about. We also want to put a bar button item, so we'll search for button. So we can have our back button there. We're looking for bar button item. We'll drag that over, double click on the word item, and change that to the word back. Now, what we want to do is we want to put a web view up here. And the web view's purpose is to display a web page. So we're going to search for web. And we're going to drag a web view. And like the image view, we want to resize it to be the entire size of the page. So like the image view we had on the home page, except now we have a nav bar to work with as well. Want to resize it to be the entire size of the page. And we also want to include some sort of spinner that will tell us when we're loading and to please wait, essentially. So it's called an activity indicator. So I'm going to search for the word activity. So it'll bring up activity indicator view. I'm going to drag that to the center of the screen. We can now resize it as of the recent iOS, but only to a certain extent. So if we go to the options here, it's very limited. We can choose a different color. So we can choose like red, for example. And we can go with the style being either gray, white, or large white, which basically just repaints itself to be the color you choose. So large seems to be a good way to go. The large is designed for the iPad, but I could see you using it in almost any phone now because it just seems so small, the other one, right? So you're better off just going with the large one all over the place. Oh, and also don't forget to paint your nav bar to be consistent. There. And now we're basically done with the about page. So what we're going to do is we're going to Command S to save this file. And we're going to switch over to the about header file. So we're going to add two variables here. One will be for the web view and one will be for the activity indicator view. So we'll start with IB outlet, UI web view. And I call this one WB page. And the second will be IB outlet, UI activity indicator view. I'm going to call this one activity. And what we're going to do is copy and paste so we can declare our property declarations for both. So add property, non-atomic, strong, and that's it for our header file. Okay, so we'll synthesize WB page and activity. And we're going to start by configuring what web page we want to load. See, here's the thing. Even though we dragged and dropped the web view onto the storyboard, there's really no property there to allow for entering in a URL. We actually do everything in code behind the scenes, unfortunately. So we're going to do that here. And we'll do it inside view.load because view.load will auto-execute this code and launch and allow it to display the web page upon loading the page onto the screen. So there's actually 3 lines of code that are required here. And they require a couple of different objects. The first object is NSURL. We're going to declare an NSURL object. I'm going to call this one URL address. And I'll set it equal to NSURL and call the method URL with string. And my argument will just be an address. Now I'll start with something like http://www.tsn.ca. So the sports network. And we'll find that there's a couple of things that they've introduced for iOS 8 and 9 that have made it difficult to display web pages, and we'll talk about it when we load this page on the screen. The next thing that we need to declare is an object that will handle making the request for this web page. It's called NSURLRequest. I'm just going to call this one URL is equal to NSURLRequest. We're going to call the method request with URL and just pass in URL address. And then the third step is just to say make it so and go ahead and load the web page. So we're going to say WB page load request and pass in URL. And that's it. That's all there's to it for loading a web page. Now let's just recap what's here. So there's 3 lines of code here that have meaning. The first line is that we're going to create an object of type NSURL. It's going to house the URL that we want to load. The second line of code is going to create an object called NSURLRequest. And NSURLRequest purpose is to handle the request itself, going and actually to the internet and actually making the request, going to find the server and downloading the information. And then the third line of code is for the web view to then go ahead and say, let's load this URL request object, which houses the URL object that we need with the URL that we want to go to. So the third line of code says, go ahead and do this. So 3 lines of code to do this. Now, what we'll do is we'll connect everything up and run this thing. And there's still more to do, but we'll start off with what's here. So we'll switch back to the storyboard and go over to the About page and open up Connections Inspector and make sure our yellow circle is highlighted. Connect our activity to the activity indicator and connect WB page to the web view and load it up. Go ahead and run the app. Okay. So now we're loading. And if I go to the About page, and you'll see that my thing is static, but look at, there's going to be a message that'll pop up down here in Xcode. Maybe I have to unhide this. There we go. It says that my game app transport security has blocked a clear text HTTP resource load since it's insecure ... So there's 2 options. We can actually provide an exception inside of our info.plist file, which is a special settings file for the app, or we can go ahead with an HTTPS web page or website. So we'll take the route of going with a secure web page. So one solution is we're not allowed to use HTTP websites anymore, and the only way to get around that is to actually include an exception in our app. But let's just stick with including or using an HTTP website or HTTPS website. So we're going to go back to about.m and fix that. So we could take like a banking website, for example, and those are typically secure. Uh, Google is actually secure, so we can go to google.ca and do that. Instead of going with tsn.ca, let's go with google.ca, but say https://google.ca. And run this again. And so this time, we hit the About page. The spinner isn't doing anything, which is expected. The spinner is not going to do anything. But instead, it's going to load Google. We haven't configured the spinner, that's why. And the spinner is still sitting in front of Google. So now we have to configure the spinner, or the activity indicator. But at least we know that Google loads. But hitting the back button, we forgot to do something here. Forgot to connect our back button as well. Okay, so one thing we'll do, because we forgot, is just connect the back button to the exit button. Unwind to this view controller. But let's configure the activity indicator as well. One thing I want to do is I want to make it hidden. I want to hide the activity indicator. So if I highlight the activity indicator, I'm going to make it hidden because it seems really weird that it just sits there when you load the page and it doesn't do anything. So let's hide it, and then we'll bring it back to the foreground when we're ready to load a web page, and then we'll hide it again when we're done loading the web page. That's the goal. So we're going to do that. And also, we need to trigger the view controller to actually launch this activity indicator when we're loading a page. So we have to do something special here. If we click on the web view itself and switch to the connections inspector, we'll see something called delegate. Now this is an important thing to do if we want to make sure that our activity indicator is working. So we're going to connect delegate to the yellow circle. We're going to connect delegate to the yellow circle. And so that'll connect us to our About View controller. Now what that does is it actually will say, okay, go ahead and trigger that activity indicator based on what we're about to do right now in code. So there's two special methods that we have to implement that will allow the triggering and untriggering of this activity indicator. The first thing we have to do is we have to implement an interface inside our header file. So this is our first step in implementing an interface, which we haven't done yet. Okay, now that we're in the header file, we're gonna implement an interface. Now, if we look at the line of coding for interface, we're saying add interface about view controller extends UI view controller. Now, they don't use the word interface in Objective-C. They use something called a protocol. So we're actually implementing a protocol. But in the Java world, we know it as an interface. And to recap what an interface is in Java, it's just a special class that defines methods a certain way, but it doesn't define the implementation for those methods. And in fact, it expects you to define the methods any way you want, but just so long as you use the method declarations that are outlined in the interface. So we would usually say implements and some sort of interface in Java, but here we're going to use something slightly different, but still the same operation. So we're going to use the angle brackets, so the same angle bracket that you see next to UIKit, and we're going to implement an interface called UI Web View Delegate with a closing angle bracket. So this is saying we want to use a couple of methods from the Web View Delegate that are used, in this case, for controlling loading and unloading the web page. So that's the whole purpose of it. Now, once we have this interface implemented, we're going to go ahead and actually implement the two methods that we need. So we're going to create two methods. The first method will be executed now when we first make the request to load the web page. This is going to have a void return type, and it'll start off by saying web view did start load. You'll notice that there's a few of these here. There's did fail with error, there's did finish load, and there's did start load. We're going to do these second two. So we're going to do finish and start. We'll start with web view did start load. It's a special method that is used for when you want to execute some code upon starting the web view or starting the web page that you want to load. So in this case, it's all about the activity indicator that's spinning. First thing we're going to do is unhide it. So we're going to say activity set hidden to no. and then we'll have it spin. So we'll say activity start animating. So when we ask for a web page, it's going to start spinning and it'll unhide itself. And then the second thing is also void return type. We're going to say web view did finish load. The nice thing about implementing those interfaces is that it actually brings in the auto-completion of those methods. If you didn't implement those interfaces, you still would have been able to do these methods, but you would have had to have memorized and tried to remember that code yourself. So the nice thing is that it actually tries to help you with the method declaration. So now with this, we're going to do the opposite of what we did with the previous method. We're going to say activity set hidden to yes, because we want to hide it now, because we're done loading. And we're going to say activity stop animating, because we don't really care about it animating in the background. And at this point, we can actually run the app. And so now, loads the splash screen. We'll hit about. So it's there. It's going to start spinning in a moment. Start spinning. And it goes away when Google finally loads. Now, you may not even see it. It may actually just load Google right away. And that's okay. It probably did work, but for like a millisecond, then went away. Because it may have had a cached copy of Google in this case. So you may not have even seen it. It may have just appeared, spun, and disappeared right away. But there you have it. Now we have a fully functioning app